They had walked into a beautiful, sun-drenched day, a day that promised only the simplest of pleasures. A hike, a chance to feel the clean, cold air of the Montana mountains on their faces. It was June 11th, 2021, and for 26-year-old Emily Morgan, it was meant to be an escape, a brief moment of solitude from the anxieties of her life. She was an avid outdoors woman, familiar with the trails of the vast Lolo National Forest. Her family knew this, and it brought them comfort, a quiet reassurance that she was in her element. Her parents, David and Sarah Morgan, had watched her leave that morning, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her laughter echoing in the driveway as she promised to call later. They had no way of knowing that her laughter was one of the last sounds they would ever hear from her. No way of knowing that the solitude she sought would become an eternal silence. In the days that followed, the silence would grow, a deafening absence that consumed their world. The initial alarm was not a panicked shout, but a creeping dread. Emily was punctual, reliable. When the sun set and her phone remained silent, a cold knot began to form in her mother's stomach. The first call to the local sheriff's office was hesitant, almost apologetic. "She's probably just out of range," Sarah said, trying to convince herself as much as the dispatcher. But deep down, she knew. This was not Emily. The next morning, the search began. It was a massive undertaking, a grim tapestry of coordinated effort and desperate hope. Dozens of volunteers, search and rescue teams, and law enforcement officers descended upon the forest. Helicopters roared overhead, their searchlights sweeping through the dense canopy of pines and firs, a stark contrast to the quiet whispers of the wind. They combed through every known trail, every ravine, every stream. They found her car, neatly parked at the trailhead, a chilling testament to her planned return. Inside, her wallet, keys, and phone lay untouched on the passenger seat, a perfect, unnerving still life. The investigators, led by seasoned Sheriff Thomas Vance, were immediately puzzled. Why would she leave her phone behind? Was it an act of carelessness or something far more deliberate? Emily's friends and family described her as meticulous, a planner. This detail didn't fit. The forest itself became a character in this unfolding tragedy. It was a place of immense beauty and immense danger, a labyrinth of shadow and light. Every rock, every twisted root, every fallen log seemed to hold a secret. The search dogs, trained to pick up human scent, would follow a trail for a time, only to lose it abruptly, as if the scent had simply evaporated into the thin mountain air. The initial theory was simple, tragic, and common: a misstep, a fall, an injury. Perhaps she was disoriented, sheltering somewhere, waiting for rescue. The search was a race against time, with each passing hour diminishing the chances of a happy ending. But as days bled into a week, and a week into two, the initial theory began to crumble. There was no sign of a fall, no broken branches, no disturbed earth. The trail around her car was clean, undisturbed. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, a ghost in her own story. The media picked up the story, and Emily's face, a smiling, vibrant image from a family photo, was plastered on screens across the country. The public, captivated by the mystery of the missing hiker, offered theories ranging from the plausible to the preposterous. The Morgans, in the eye of this storm, held onto a fragile, desperate hope. They gave interviews, their voices cracking with emotion, pleading for any information. Sarah spoke of her daughter's love for the outdoors, her quiet strength. David recounted their last conversation, the mundane details now imbued with a terrible significance. For 5 years, the case went cold. The search efforts dwindled, the public's attention moved on to other mysteries. But for Sheriff Vance, and for the Morgan family, the case was never closed. It was a wound that refused to heal. Vance kept a thick folder on his desk, the name Emily Morgan, written in neat black letters. He would pull it out late at night, poring over the old reports, the diagrams of the search grid, the chilling photographs of the empty car. He felt a deep, personal responsibility for the case, a weight that had settled on his shoulders and never left. The passage of time was a cruel, relentless force. It turned hope into resignation, then into a silent, aching acceptance. Emily's memory was preserved in 1,000 small ways: a framed photo on a mantel, a birthday celebrated with a somber gathering, a silent toast to a life that had been cut short. The forest, in its vast indifference, had claimed her, and it seemed it would never give her back. But as the 5th anniversary of her disappearance approached, a new narrative began to unfold, not from the diligent work of investigators, but from a twist of fate. A terrible, cruel twist of fate that would finally break the silence and reveal a truth more horrific than any of their initial fears. The truth was buried, not just beneath the earth, but beneath years of assumptions and unanswered questions. It was a truth that would expose the dark heart of a community and the sinister nature of a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight. It was a story of a beautiful day, a simple hike, and a journey into the dark heart of a forest that held a secret far more sinister than a simple accident. Emily Morgan had not been lost. She had been found 5 years too late, and the story of how she was discovered would change everything they thought they knew about her disappearance. It was a grim discovery, made by a seasoned trapper named Silas, who was checking his lines far off the beaten path, in a part of the forest no hiker would ever venture. He had found her, or what was left of her, and the sight was something no one should ever have to witness. Her remains were a tragic testament to the passage of time, but what surrounded them, what was buried with her, was the key to a story the forest had kept for half a decade. The investigation would now shift from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, and the truth, once uncovered, would bring with it a new kind of silence, the silence of profound shock and unbearable grief. This was not a story about a woman who had fallen. This was a story about a woman who had been taken, and the story of who took her was about to be revealed, a chilling conclusion to a mystery that had haunted a town and a family for 5 long years. The call that came into Sheriff Vance's office on that somber June morning was not like the others. It wasn't a panicked family member or a hopeful volunteer with a dubious lead. It was a trapper, a man of few words, his voice raspy with an unspoken horror. He spoke of a discovery, a word so carefully chosen it held the weight of a grim foreboding. He gave a location, a remote coordinates deep in the forest, far from the well-trodden trails. Vance felt a familiar chill, the kind that had settled in his bones 5 years ago. He had a gut feeling this was it. This was Emily. The discovery was not a body in the traditional sense. It was a burial site, a crude, shallow grave dug beneath the sprawling root system of a massive Douglas fir. The earth, undisturbed for years, was now telling a story. The initial forensics team arrived, their movements solemn and methodical. They had to be. This wasn't a simple recovery. It was an excavation of a tragedy. As they worked, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the soft scrape of their tools and the hushed tones of their conversations. The team confirmed it was human remains. The clothing fragments, faded and tattered, were the first clue. A grey hiking jacket, the kind Emily's mother had described in heart-wrenching detail 5 years ago. A small silver pendant was found clutched in the skeletal remains of a hand, a delicate piece of jewellery her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. It was a bird, wings outstretched in flight, an ironically cruel symbol of freedom. The emotional weight of the moment was palpable. It wasn't just a forensic site. It was the final resting place of a young woman whose life had been violently cut short. But the grimness of the discovery was only the beginning. The forensic anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, was a quiet, intense professional, known for her ability to read a body like a book. As she meticulously examined the bones, her expression grew more and more somber. The report she later filed would send a shockwave through the investigation. Emily had not died from a fall or an exposure to the elements. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. The impact was so severe, so forceful, that it was inconsistent with an accidental fall. This was no tragic accident. This was murder. And the manner of the burial itself told a different story. The shallow grave, the way the body had been deliberately concealed beneath the roots. It spoke of a frantic effort to hide a crime, not a compassionate burial. Someone had killed Emily, and then, with a terrible calculation, had tried to erase her from the face of the earth. But the discovery of the burial site was only the first chapter of this new, terrifying narrative. The second, and perhaps most disturbing piece of evidence, was found nestled near her remains, half buried in the soil. It was an old, rusted arrowhead, its edges still sharp despite the years. It was not a tool, it was a weapon. The arrowhead, upon closer inspection, appeared to be ancient, a relic from a different time. It was an object out of place, an anachronism in a modern tragedy. Why was it there? Was it a bizarre calling card, a sinister signature left by the killer? Vance had seen a lot of things in his career, but this was new. It was deeply disturbing. The discovery completely upended the 5-year-old case. It was no longer about a missing person. It was about a killer, still at large, a predator who had evaded justice for half a decade. The focus shifted from the where to the who and the why. The first step was to revisit the initial investigation, to re-examine every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every alibi, with the new knowledge that a murder had been committed. They started with the car, which had been in police impound for years. It was now a crime scene. A team of forensic specialists went over it with a fine-toothed comb, looking for anything that might have been overlooked, any microscopic piece of evidence that could link a suspect to the crime. They found nothing. It was eerily clean, as if the killer had taken great care to wipe away any trace of their presence. The lack of evidence was, in itself, a chilling clue. It suggested a level of premeditation, a killer who knew what they were doing. The focus then shifted to Emily's life. Who would want to harm her? Her family, her friends, her colleagues, every person who had been interviewed 5 years ago was now re-interviewed, their lives scrutinized, their stories re-examined for inconsistencies. The initial interviews, conducted under the assumption of a missing person case, were now seen through a new lens, a lens of suspicion and potential deceit. The pressure on Vance was immense. The media, which had long since abandoned the story, was now back with a renewed fervour. The public wanted answers. The Morgan family, whose grief had settled into a quiet ache, was now forced to confront a new, more horrific reality. The discovery had not brought closure. It had brought a new, agonizing kind of pain. Sarah Morgan, in a brief, tearful statement to the press, said, "We always knew something was wrong. But this is a nightmare." The investigation became a grim puzzle, each new piece of information a shard of broken glass. The arrowhead, the car, the blunt force trauma, each detail pointed to a different, unsettling possibility. But as the investigators dug deeper, a new person of interest began to emerge, a figure who had been on the periphery of the original investigation, but had never been a central suspect. This individual was a local artifact hunter, a man with a reputation for exploring the most remote parts of the forest, a man who had been interviewed 5 years ago and had provided a seemingly airtight alibi. His name was Peter Crowley, and his story was about to unravel. The investigators, with the help of the new forensic evidence, began to see the gaps in his story, the small, seemingly insignificant details that now loomed large. The case was no longer a mystery of a woman lost in the wilderness. It was the story of a deliberate, violent act, hidden in plain sight, and the terrible journey to uncover the truth. The long, silent years of the case were about to be broken, not by a gentle whisper of the wind, but by the roar of a horrific revelation. The dark secrets of the forest were finally about to be revealed, and with them, the dark secrets of a human heart. The investigation, now a homicide case, took a sharp and dramatic turn. Sheriff Vance and his team had to completely re-evaluate everything they thought they knew. The most immediate and intriguing piece of evidence was the arrowhead. Forensic analysis of the soil and the rust on its surface, while not a perfect match, suggested it had been in the ground for a similar amount of time as Emily's remains. This relic, a strange and violent anachronism, had to have a deeper meaning. It was too specific, too out of place to be a random coincidence. The team began a meticulous, painstaking search into local history and known artifact hunters. The name that kept reappearing was Peter Crowley. Crowley was a reclusive figure, a man who lived on the outskirts of town, his life dedicated to scouring the forests and fields for remnants of the past. He was known to sell his finds to private collectors, often skirting the edges of the law. His alibi from 5 years ago had been simple. He was out hunting, alone, miles from the trailhead where Emily's car was found. It was an alibi that was difficult, if not impossible, to disprove at the time. But now, with a new focus, the investigators went back to his original statement. They found subtle inconsistencies, small verbal stumbles that had been dismissed as nervousness then, but now looked like a nervous killer trying to remember a false story. The discovery of the arrowhead gave the police a reason to obtain a new search warrant for his property. What they found there would prove to be the linchpin of the entire case. Crowley's small, cluttered cabin was a treasure trove of historical artifacts, dusty and unorganized. In a corner, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers, they found a journal. It was a hunting log, a detailed record of his expeditions into the wilderness. The entries were terse and factual, documenting dates, locations, and his finds. The entry for June 11th, 2021, the day Emily vanished, was a single, cryptic sentence. It spoke of a rare and valuable find. There was no mention of a person, no hint of violence. But a different, more chilling entry was found several pages earlier, an entry from a week before the disappearance. It detailed a frustration with a specific area of the forest, a place he called the Labyrinth, a dense, secluded section of old-growth pines he believed held a significant archaeological site. It was an area known to very few, a place where the trails disappeared, and the landscape became a confusing maze of ravines and dense underbrush. The location was a perfect match for where Emily's body was found. The connection was growing stronger, but it was still circumstantial. The journal entry didn't mention Emily, and there was no definitive proof of a murder. The investigators needed more. They brought Peter Crowley in for questioning again. This time, the interrogation was different. It wasn't a friendly chat with a potential witness. It was a tense, focused grilling of a primary suspect. The investigators laid out their new evidence: the arrowhead, the journal, the location. They watched as the facade of the quiet, reclusive trapper began to crack. He denied everything at first, his voice low and defiant. He claimed the arrowhead was an old find, that the journal entry was a reference to a specific type of rock formation he had found, not a person. But the investigators had one more card to play. They had also found a piece of torn fabric buried in the soil near the arrowhead. It was a specific type of synthetic material, a microfiber used in modern hiking jackets. And when they had found it, they had also found a single, small drop of dried blood on the fibers. The forensic lab had run a DNA test. It was a partial match, but a match nonetheless, to Emily Morgan. When confronted with this piece of evidence, Crowley's composure finally broke. His defiance turned to a sullen silence, and then a slow, grudging confession began to emerge. The story, he told, was a twisted tale of a chance encounter and a moment of impulse. He claimed he had been in the labyrinth, following a faint game trail, when he came across Emily. She was off the main path, a small, vibrant figure against the vast, silent backdrop of the forest. He said they had a brief conversation. He had warned her she was in a dangerous area, a place where people could get lost easily. He then noticed a small, ancient-looking object hanging from her backpack. It was a small, ornate piece of stone, an artifact he believed was of immense historical value. He claimed he had offered to buy it, but she had refused, saying it was just a rock she had found, something she had picked up for her niece. The conversation had grown tense. He had become agitated, consumed by a possessive, almost pathological desire for the artifact. He saw it as his, something the forest had meant for him to find. He had followed her for a short while, and then, in a moment of pure, unadulterated rage, he had struck her with a rock he was carrying. He had then buried her, and, in a final act of grotesque symbolism, had placed the ancient arrowhead near her body. He claimed it was a kind of macabre offering, a silent prayer to the forest gods that had granted him his prize. But when the investigators pressed him on the artifact he claimed to have taken, he couldn't describe it, couldn't produce it. His story began to unravel under the weight of its own inconsistencies. He wasn't a meticulous killer. He was a violent, impulsive man who had panicked and tried to cover his tracks. The arrowhead wasn't a symbol, it was a tool. The real truth was likely much simpler and much more sinister. The rock he had used to strike her, he claimed, he had thrown into a ravine. It was a detail that felt too rehearsed, too convenient. The police, however, had the confession they needed. The years of searching, the months of investigation, had come to a grim conclusion. The mystery of Emily's disappearance was finally solved, but the truth it revealed was not the one anyone had hoped for. The peaceful, beautiful forest was not the kind of wilderness that claimed its victims through accident and exposure. It was a place where a man's violent, unchecked rage had taken a life. The silence of the forest, once a symbol of peace, now held a terrifying new meaning. The silence of a hidden grave, the silence of a terrible crime, and the silence of a killer who had walked among them, unnoticed, for 5 long, agonizing years. Emily Morgan had not been lost to the wilderness. She had been taken from the world, and her story, once a tale of a tragic accident, was now a chilling testament to the dark side of human nature. The arrest of Peter Crowley brought with it a different kind of silence. The media frenzy, which had consumed the town for weeks, suddenly quieted, replaced by a stunned collective sense of shock and disbelief. The truth of Emily's death, once a source of frantic speculation, had now been laid bare, and it was a reality far more disturbing than any of the initial theories. The narrative of a tragic accident, of a young woman lost to the unforgiving wilderness, was a comfort compared to the cold, brutal fact of murder. The town, which had mourned her loss with a certain sense of shared sympathy, now had to reckon with the presence of a killer who had lived among them for 5 years, a man whose quiet demeanor had masked a violent and pathological rage. The case against Crowley was strong, built on a foundation of his own confession, the forensic evidence, and the irrefutable link between the arrowhead and the crime scene. His trial was a somber affair, a public reliving of a tragedy that had already haunted a community for half a decade. The Morgan family, present in the courtroom every day, sat in quiet, dignified grief. They had endured the long years of uncertainty, the crushing burden of not knowing, and now they had to sit and listen to the horrific details of their daughter's last moments. Sarah Morgan, in a tear-stained statement to the press after the verdict was delivered, spoke not of vengeance, but of the simple, unbearable weight of the truth. "We have answers," she said, her voice a thin whisper, "but they don't bring her back." The conviction of Peter Crowley was a victory for law enforcement and a moment of justice for the Morgan family, but it was not closure. The deep, jagged wound of their loss would never fully heal. The silence that had once defined Emily's disappearance, the silence of the forest, the silence of the unanswered phone, had been replaced by a new, more profound silence. The silence of a life that had been stolen, the silence of a community grappling with the knowledge that a quiet, unassuming neighbour had committed an act of unspeakable violence. The story, however, did not end with the trial. The discovery of Emily's remains and the subsequent investigation had unearthed a series of smaller, more unsettling mysteries. The arrowhead, for instance. Forensic anthropologists confirmed it was indeed an ancient artifact, a piece of a forgotten history. But its presence at the murder scene remained a baffling, almost surreal detail. Was it simply a tool of opportunity, as Crowley had claimed? Or did it have a darker, more symbolic meaning? The psychological profile of Crowley, compiled by forensic psychiatrists, painted a picture of a man obsessed with the past, a hoarder of history, who saw himself not as a collector, but as a protector of ancient knowledge. His confession, though it provided the necessary legal evidence, was still full of strange and contradictory details, a kind of fever dream of obsession and violence. The idea that he had murdered Emily over a valuable artifact he couldn't describe felt like a story, a narrative he had constructed to justify an unjustifiable act. The true motive, the profilers suggested, was likely far more mundane and far more chilling. A moment of unprovoked rage, a violent impulse acted upon in a moment of perceived weakness. The true catalyst was likely not an artifact, but a simple, human encounter that ended in a fatal confrontation. The narrative of the case, once a mystery of the wilderness, had transformed into a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk within the human heart. The forest, once the villain of the story, was now just the silent backdrop to a human tragedy. It was a place of immense beauty and natural danger, but the real threat had been a person, not the environment. For Sheriff Vance, the case would forever be a defining moment in his career. He had seen the worst of human nature, and he had learned that sometimes the most disturbing truths are not found in the grand, sweeping gestures of a criminal mastermind, but in the small, violent acts of a disturbed individual. The cold case file, once a symbol of his failure, was now a grim testament to the perseverance of his team. But the victory felt hollow. He had found Emily, but he had found her in the most terrible way imaginable. The town slowly began to heal. A small memorial was placed at the trailhead where Emily's car had been found, a simple stone bench with a plaque bearing her name and the dates of her short life. Hikers would stop there, a quiet moment of reflection, a silent tribute to a life that had been cut short. The forest, with its vast indifference, continued to grow. The roots of the Douglas fir where Emily had been buried slowly, silently, weaving themselves into the earth, holding the final secret of her story. The silence had been broken, but the echoes of her disappearance and the terrible truth of her death would continue to resonate, a somber and powerful reminder that not all mysteries are solved by a simple answer. Sometimes the answers are more painful than the questions, and some stories once told can never be untold, their truths forever woven into the fabric of a community, a family, and a desolate, beautiful wilderness. The story of Emily Morgan's vanishing and her eventual grim discovery was no longer a mystery. It was a stark, brutal account of a life taken, a secret held, and the long, slow, agonizing journey to the truth, a journey that began with a beautiful day and ended in a chilling revelation beneath the roots of a pine tree. The community, having processed the initial shock of the murder conviction, began to look for meaning in the aftermath. Memorials were established, scholarships were created in Emily's name, and a new sense of vigilance settled over the town. The trails, once a place of carefree recreation, were now viewed with a different, more cautious eye. Parents warned their children to stay in groups, and hikers were encouraged to carry communication devices, a grim lesson learned from Emily's final silent moments. The forest, a character in this tragedy, began to take on a new, more complex identity. It was no longer just a place of beauty and solitude, it was also a place of a hidden grave, a crime scene. But for the Morgan family, the years that followed the conviction were a different kind of struggle. The trial had brought a temporary cessation to their long-standing uncertainty, but it hadn't filled the void left by their daughter's absence. The grim details of the confession, the image of Emily's last moments, were a new, more painful set of memories to contend with. Sarah Morgan found solace in advocacy, working with a national organization for families of missing and murdered persons. She used her own tragic experience to help others navigate the labyrinthine and often heart-wrenching process of searching for a loved one. She became an eloquent and powerful voice, her pain channeled into a purpose that honored her daughter's memory. David Morgan, quieter and more introspective, spent his time in Emily's garden, a place she had tended with love and care. He found a quiet comfort in the rhythm of the seasons, the cyclical nature of life and death, and the simple fact that the flowers Emily had planted still bloomed every spring, a silent testament to her enduring spirit. The case itself became a subject of study for other law enforcement agencies. The meticulous, 5-year cold case investigation and the crucial role of a single piece of forensic evidence, the arrowhead in breaking it open, was hailed as a model of perseverance and modern investigative techniques. Sheriff Vance, who had been a quiet hero in this story, was often asked to speak at conferences to recount the journey from a missing person case to a murder investigation. He always spoke of Emily with a quiet reverence, a profound respect for the victim at the heart of the story. He never forgot the weight of the moment when he first saw the small, silver pendant at the crime scene, the fragile, beautiful object that had survived the years to bear witness to a terrible truth. The narrative of the case had changed from a mystery to a warning. It was no longer about the great unknown of the wilderness, but about the deeply unsettling darkness that can exist within a human being. The story was a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not mythical beasts, but men who live and breathe and walk among us, their violence hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. The case had also brought to light a small, disturbing subculture of artifact hunters, men like Peter Crowley, who operated on the fringes of society, driven by an obsessive, often pathological desire to possess relics of the past. The police department, prompted by the circumstances of the case, began a more concerted effort to track these individuals, to monitor their activities, and to ensure that historical preservation and human safety were not compromised by their clandestine pursuits. But as the years passed and the memory of the case faded from the national consciousness, a new, more insidious rumor began to circulate in the town. It was a hushed conversation, whispered in coffee shops and over fences, a new theory that a small group of locals had helped Crowley, either in the murder or in the subsequent cover-up. The theory was, of course, unsubstantiated, a product of a community still reeling from the shock of the truth. But the rumor lingered, a faint, unsettling shadow on a story that was supposed to be closed. The police had investigated and found no evidence of accomplices, but in a small town, a rumor can take on a life of its own, twisting a resolved tragedy into a new, unending mystery. The case of Emily Morgan was now a part of the town's folklore, a modern ghost story, a grim fable passed down from generation to generation. The story had become a different kind of narrative, a cautionary tale about trust and about the deep and hidden darkness that can reside in even the most seemingly peaceful of places. The forest, for all its beauty, was no longer just a place to escape. It was a place to remember, a silent, somber monument to a life that had been taken, and a testament to the long, difficult, and often incomplete journey toward justice and closure. The true, final chapter of Emily Morgan's story belongs not to the court documents or the press clippings, but to the slow, quiet process of time and remembrance. 5 years had passed since her remains were found, and a full decade since she first walked into the forest, a vibrant, hopeful young woman. The initial shock had given way to a settled grief, a pain that had become an intrinsic part of the Morgan family's existence. Her parents, David and Sarah, now in their twilight years, spoke of their daughter not with sorrow, but with a gentle, reflective love. They shared stories of her childhood, her passion for the outdoors, and the small, beautiful details of her life that had nothing to do with her death. The community, in turn, had not forgotten. The memorial bench at the trailhead had become a local landmark, a place where people would leave small offerings: a stone, a wildflower, a single, handwritten note. It was a quiet, collective acknowledgement of her story and of the enduring impact it had on the town. The police file on the case, once a living document of an ongoing mystery, was now a historical archive, a testament to the tireless work of Sheriff Vance and his team. Vance himself, now retired, would occasionally take a quiet drive out to the trailhead, his own personal pilgrimage. He would sit on the bench, his thoughts a quiet mix of professional reflection and personal sadness. He had solved the case, but he knew that no amount of justice could ever truly mend the broken pieces of a family's heart. The forest itself, in its vast and silent indifference, had long since reclaimed the burial site. The ground where Emily had been found was now indistinguishable from the surrounding woods, covered by a new layer of pine needles and fallen leaves. The old Douglas fir, its roots still grasping the earth, stood as a silent, natural monument, a living witness to a forgotten tragedy. The arrowhead, the key piece of evidence that had broken the case, was now in a police evidence lockup, a curious and unsettling artifact that had brought with it both a solution and a deeper set of questions. It was a grim reminder that history and the present can sometimes collide in the most violent and unexpected of ways. The story of Emily Morgan had evolved into a narrative far beyond a simple crime. It was a meditation on loss, on the nature of evil, and on the long, difficult road to peace. It was a story about the fragile boundary between civilization and the wilderness, and about the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected of places. It was a powerful reminder that the quiet, unassuming landscape of the forest could hide a truth far more sinister than any of its natural dangers. And so, the story of Emily Morgan, the young hiker who vanished and was found 5 years later beneath the roots of a pine tree, came to a quiet and somber close. The dramatic tension of the initial mystery had faded, replaced by the profound stillness of an understood tragedy. The silence, once a symbol of the unknown, was now a quiet testament to the enduring memory of a life that was taken too soon, a life that, through its loss, had taught a community a terrible and lasting lesson about the hidden realities of the human heart. Her story, no longer a mystery, was now a somber piece of the landscape, a permanent part of the quiet, beautiful, and forever changed Montana wilderness.